Good morning. My name is Susan Forseille, and I come from Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia. Today I'm going to talk about the impact of conscious and unconscious colonial practices on the indigenization of prior learning assessment at TRU. I'm going to start with the territorial acknowledgement. This is something we do in Canada, and as I know in other countries, to show our respect and understanding of the land that we reside on. And I'm honored to live, work, learn, and play on the Tk'emlúps-Tshwétnuk territories. And this is a picture of the territory. Tk'emlúps means meeting of the waters in Shwétmikulu. Just a quick visual of where we're from. It's quite a ways away. There's Kamloops Way in Western Canada, and Paris feels like halfway around the world, but I know people have come farther. Just going to go back to this phrase. This phrase here, Kamukimwa, means we come together to help one another, and I'm adopting their philosophy for today's session, and indeed, this has been something we've been working on for the last 6-7 years. Okay, I'm going to leave the screen now to get more natural. The last couple of years I've presented at ePIC, and I've shared some stories. The first time I presented at ePIC, I shared a story about residential schools. How many of you in the audience have heard of residential schools? It's important for me to know that because I'm not sure how far I need to go back into the history. This painting here is by an Indigenous artist named Kent Monkman. He's named it The Scream from 2017. And this is his representation of residential schools. Although they started in the 1800s, the last one didn't close down until 1997. So not that long ago. I know. Yes, I'm surprised with that too. What do you see in this image? Go ahead and shout it out. Government, kidnapping, church. What happened in these schools was the word that was used in the day in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they wanted to beat the Indian out of the child. So they put him in these schools and took away their families, took away their communities, took away their language, took away their culture, beat them if they spoke their language. There was physical abuse, mental abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. Indeed, 1 of 25 students approximately didn't survive these schools. And as you can imagine, generation after generation of people that went to these schools didn't know how to raise families, didn't know how to love their children, and there's intergenerational trauma past that. So that's what I presented in my first session and what that meant for learning. In 2018, we started a path. We understood the damage that the residential schools had done, and we wanted to look for a way that we could integrate existing PLAR knowledge, prior learning knowledge, and resources with Indigenous teachings and perspectives, and valuing the richness of Indigenous knowledge systems. So at this time, we were only decolonizing, and for decolonizing, I'm using it as the words meaning to remove some of those Western barriers we've put in place. So we started in 2018. We conducted research. Who else was doing this type of work in Canada in post-secondary schools? How were they doing it? What could we learn from them? We consulted extensively with community members, so the elders, the knowledge keepers, the matriarchs. We applied for funding. We did a lot of this work off the side of our desk, and we have a very busy program. We're one of the busiest prior learning programs in Canada. We consulted with and we hired staff. So we hired Indigenous staff, 2 Indigenous PLAR developers, and an Indigenous advisor and an Indigenous assessor. And we began building together a way of, if you look at the bare bones of prior learning assessment, it is to surface the learning, to reflect on the learning, to share the learning, and then to assess the learning. We wanted to find a new way to do that that was culturally appropriate. And this picture here of the forest, and if you can look very closely, there's a deer path there. We followed a path that hadn't been created yet, and we were making it as we were going along. Last year, one of our students came with us, Justin Thundersky Young, and his daughter, Cecina. And in Indigenous cultures in Canada, it's very common for your children to be learning from the youngest age. So my colleague has a 2-year-old. He was teaching younger kids how to drum at 2 years old. It's not uncommon to have the children in meetings and to actually have a voice. Justin came and shared his story of the decolonization we had been doing, what worked, what didn't work, and how some of what we hadn't done yet had traumatized him. With all of this learning, I put together this chart of something I was keeping in my head. What is the difference between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge? So what are some of those worldviews? And on this chart here, I'm not going to go through it word by word because we don't have enough time. But on this chart here, you'll see at the top you have the Western worldview and the Indigenous worldview. And then on the side, you have some of the basic knowledge understandings. So the methodology, the truth, relatedness, land use, time, values, and then I put a visual aid at the very bottom. I just want to go through a couple of these really important ones. They're all important, but I'll just highlight a couple. So I'm going to start at the very top with the knowledge methodology. So the Western worldview tends to have scientific as its base with a skepticism and requires proof as a basis of belief. Whereas Indigenous worldviews is based on belief in spiritual world traditions and cultural practices. So very different there. And you look at truth. Western worldviews, truth is often based on what we can see, based on science and law. Back to that picture of the residential schools, somebody mentioned they saw the law there, the RCMP delivering the law. And the Indigenous worldviews, that there can be many truths dependent on individuals' experiences and beliefs. Time is also very different. So we're organized here today by time, and I have 15, 20 minutes to talk. But if I was speaking with an elder and they talked for 20 minutes, I would be very thankful and happy that I got that 20 minutes. If they spoke for 2 hours, I would be very thankful and honored that I got the 2 hours, and other things would have to change time-wise because you wouldn't interrupt them, you would just honor them. Also very nonlinear and very related to the seasons still to this day. Values is the last one I want to touch on, and the values for Indigenous people, I'll just speak to that. They have the 6 R's, and that includes respect, relationships, which goes back to the relatedness, representation, relevance, responsibility, and reciprocity. The images on the bottom here, I think, summarize this very well. You see man at the top of the Western worldviews, where they control the resources and it's their right to do that. Whereas you look at the Indigenous worldviews from the communities we've been working with, and you see men, women, we were part of a much bigger relationship. And their place on the earth is to take care of the land. So despite all of this research, now we've been doing this since 2018, all this work, all this thought, I am still personally underestimating the extent of my ingrained colonized ways and how this has profoundly impacted this work. So I started by looking at the big picture 2 years ago. Last year, we looked at the student experience. Now I want to speak to what is my role, our role, as the colonizer's role in this. And I don't want to lose sight as we're here talking about what is open education. This is a really important consideration. So I'm really struggling still with my unconscious and my conscious biases. And just a couple of thoughts I put here. My ability to comprehend crucial information being shared, so whether it's from the elders or the matriarchs or the language holders, and my profound persistence in my preconceived notions of what is needed, what we need to accomplish and how we can proceed. So even doing a needs assessment study and an environmental scan are very colonized ways of doing. And that deep pervasive Western-centric assumptions that are inherent in all we do. So I'm just gonna go back to Justin for a moment. Justin was one of the first students that we really decolonized what we were doing with the PLAR process. And we did excellent. We really were thoughtful, we listened, we adjusted things for him, and we get to the end of the process. And I'm feeling quite happy that we had gotten to this point and we'd had this success and the learning had been profound. We get to the end of the process and it's an interview with Justin and 2 assessors going through his portfolio and asking him questions about his prior learning. At that point in time, it was an interview, and we sat him down and we asked 24 questions based on 8 competencies. We had an hour and a half to do it. Justin had brought his drum so that he could do an honor song before we started. He said a prayer to the elders, and he also brought stuff to do a smudge. He left that interview very alienated, feeling that we hadn't heard his authentic story. We had gone through such a linear, such a compartmentalized process that he felt that we'd taken the whole process back to the colonized roots, and it traumatized him. Not only did he feel very traumatized by that experience, then we give him a very traditional form letter to say these were the credits were awarded, and he cried out of happiness because he got all the credits he was asking for, and out of sadness over how we had shared that information with him. So that's Justin. Just this week, in my head, I had a group of students complaining about some of our fees for PLAR, Indigenous students. And in my head, I said, it's just $30. If they really want the PLAR, they'll find a way to pay the $30. One of our Indigenous PLAR developers gently reminded me $30 to them is gas. They live in rural, out-of-the-way places. It's gas to go to town to buy groceries for the week. It's money for their children to get the new pair of shoes at the discount store. Again, you can see how my Western worldviews was impacting my decision-making. And I've seen this slide a few times. We saw it yesterday. This is Nan Travers' work, and I see that it's kind of cut off at the bottom there. We only assess what we cherish, and I've been living in the world where that little red circle, that's what my university cherishes, and that's what we've been working with Indigenous students to assess. But when you look at their worldviews, their knowledge systems, what they know, there's so much more that we can and should be assessing. And just back to the epistemology of whose knowledge is most valued, and the ontology of truth and knowledge and how we know what we know, we're missing so much. So just down to the last few slides here. The impact on the learner has been profound. So even with everything we know and all we've been doing and all we've been learning, we're still reinforcing the colonial power dynamics because of those unconscious and conscious biases, which is resulting in decreased trust in post-secondary institutions, reduced opportunities for Indigenous students and communities to contribute to changes. And we want to use what we're learning from the Indigenous students and apply it to all of our programming. And if we're still having those biases, and especially unconscious biases, that impacts how much we can change and improve our processes. Lower academic achievements, because there have been students without the agency, without the self-worth, without the confidence that have walked away from the process. That limits their academic achievements, makes them feel alienated, marginalized, and invisible, reduces their sense of self-worth and agency. And one of the things that we were most hopeful with PLAR was the confidence in their cultural identity being increased. And then, of course, we're also impacting our relationships with communities. And that's just 8. There's many more I could mention. So as I look out over this group today, and we're down to about the last 2 minutes, I want you to all ask yourselves, what have you done to surface and to reflect on and to share with others? What have been some of your conscious and unconscious biases, and how has that impacted your work? Lastly, I'll leave with what are our next steps. So we're going to continue to increase our awareness, reflect on it, and continue to build that path forward. We're going to learn from community. We're working with 3 Indigenous communities right now on how to do prior learning assessment in culturally appropriate ways. We're exploring alternative forms of sharing prior learning, so trying to move it from the colonized into the indigenized space. One of the things I'm most excited about is students. They're going to tell us what they've learned and how they've learned it, and they're going to assign value to it. That's going to be part of the assessment process. Our team personally needs a lot of work and development, so we're going to continue to do professional development. We're going to continue to establish diverse assessment teams with elders and knowledge keepers on the teams. We're going to provide transparent guidelines for what we're assessing and how we're assessing it. And again, the communities are going to have the complete say in how we're doing this. They're going to guide that practice, and I'm going to work really hard to make sure the university follows it. We're going to adapt a peer review system so that we're going to analyze and discuss how we're doing at each step of the path and change or pivot as needed. And we're going to keep learning from our mistakes so that we can do better. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Is there for Susan?
Thank you for sharing your presentation. I wonder if the efforts you are going to, how do you create a system change within the university as opposed to champions driving it? So if the people leave, it still continues to be embedded within the university.
So you're talking about succession planning?
just more, if you were to leave that organization today with all your goodwill and all your knowings and understandings, how do you ensure that it's embedded in the system of the university?
That's an excellent question. Not just through our policies, we've embedded this in our policies, it's in our procedures, it's in our practices. And the phrase I've used is, as we're walking this path, as we're creating this path, the path is getting wider and wider because people are joining us. So we have the funding we received just under $1 million to work on this. And then that's since moved into ongoing permanent funding. And we've also followed the TRU values mission statement. And actually my colleague right now tomorrow is in a meeting on strategic planning to weave this in more. So we're approaching it from various angles. Hopefully it'll work well.
It's the other side of your question. So let's say you're going somewhere else. How do you take this with you? Is there like a playbook? And would it work even in countries where there's no like indigenous traditions or the same context?
That is such a complicated answer. Yes, there is a playbook, but that playbook would need to be adapted. Even our playbook depends on the community we're working with and the politics of that community, the elders in that community, and where they are on this path. And in different countries, yes, I'm an optimist. And I think you listen with your heart and you follow their guidance.
Thank you, Susan.